1. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Active Directory Azure AD tenant named Contoso.com and an Azure Kubernetes Service AKS cluster named AKS1. An administrator reports that she is unable to grant access to AKS1 to the users in Contoso.com. You need to ensure that access to AKS1 can be granted to the Contoso.com users. What should you do first? A. From Contoso.com, modify the organization relationships settings. B. From Contoso.com, create an OAuth 2.0 authorization endpoint. C. Recreate AKS1. D. From AKS1, create a namespace. Answer B. 2. You have an Azure web app named WebApp1. Users report that they often experience HTTP 500 errors when they connect to WebApp1. You need to provide the developers of WebApp1 with real-time access to the connection errors. The solution must provide all the connection error details. What should you do first? A. From WebApp1, enable web server logging. B. From Azure Monitor, create a workbook. C. From Azure Monitor, create a service health alert. D. From WebApp1, turn on application logging. Answer A. 3. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You have 5 terabytes of data that you need to transfer to Subscription 1. You plan to use an Azure import-export job. What can you use as the destination of the imported data? A. An Azure Cosmos DB database. B. Azure File Storage. C. The Azure File Sync Storage Sync Service. D. Azure Data Factory. Answer B. 4. You have an Azure subscription named Subscription 1. You deploy a Linux virtual machine named VM1 to Subscription 1. You need to monitor the metrics and the logs of VM1. What should you use? A. Linux Diagnostic Extension LAD 3.0. B. Azure Analysis Services. C. The Azure Performance Diagnostics Extension. D. Azure HD Insight. Answer C. 5. You download an Azure Resource Manager template based on an existing virtual machine. The template will be used to deploy 100 virtual machines. You need to modify the template to reference an administrative password. You must prevent the password from being stored in plain text. What should you create to store the password? A. Azure Active Directory AD identity protection and an Azure policy. B. A recovery services vault and a backup policy. C. An Azure Key Vault and an access policy. D. An Azure Storage Account and an access policy. Answer C. 6. You have an Azure storage account named Storage 1. You plan to use AsCopy to copy data to Storage 1. You need to identify the storage services in Storage 1 to which you can copy the data. What should you identify? A. Blob, file, table, and queue. B. Blob and file only. C. File and table only. D. File only. E. Blob, table, and queue only. Answer B. 7. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines that will run Windows Server 2019 in a virtual machine scale set by using an Azure Resource Manager template. You need to ensure that Nginx is available on all the virtual machines after they are deployed. What should you use? A. Azure Active Directory Azure AD Application Proxy. B. Azure Application Insights. C. Azure Custom Script Extension. D. The new AZ Configuration Assignment CMD Let. Answer: C. 8. You have two Azure Active Directory Azure AD tenants named Contoso.com and Fabricam.com. You have a Microsoft account that you use to sign into both tenants. You need to configure the default sign-in tenant for the Azure portal. What should you do? A. From the Azure portal, configure the portal settings. B. From the Azure portal, change the directory. C. From Azure Cloud Shell, run set Azure context. D. From Azure Cloud Shell, run set Azure subscription. Answer: B. 9. You have a public load balancer that balances ports 80 and 443 across 3 virtual machines. You need to direct all the Remote Desktop Protocol (RDP) connections to VM3 only. What should you configure? A load balancing rule. B. A new public load balancer for VM3. C. An inbound NAT rule. D. A front-end IP configuration. Answer: C. 10. You have an Azure subscription that contains 100 virtual machines. You regularly create and delete virtual machines. You need to identify unused disks that can be deleted. What should you do? A. From Azure Advisor, modify the Advisor configuration. B. From Azure Cost Management view cost analysis. C. From Azure Cost Management view Advisor recommendations. D. From Microsoft Azure Storage Explorer, view the account management properties. Answer: D.